The people of Iran are not happy. The President of the United States is threatening military action, and the possibility is real enough that he is now getting briefed on the subject. Will 2026 ever give us a chance to breathe? No. The answer is no. But there is a big difference between protesters on the streets wreaking havoc and an Ayatollah moving in across the hall from Bashar al-Assad somewhere in Russia. So, today, let's discuss what the United States might do here, whether an action would be counterproductive, and what type of damage Iran could inflict in response. But let's start with some basic facts of what is happening on the ground. Protesters are basically everywhere in Iran, some upset because of the regime's ideology. However, the bulk of the grievances are from the government's mismanagement of inflation, water resources, and electricity production. And I do mean everywhere. This is the map that Wikipedia is using. It reminds me of my map showing Ukraine's attacks on Russian refineries. There gets to be a point where you cannot see where the action is happening, and we are basically there. Indeed, after about 2 weeks, the protests are also getting to the point that the regime itself is in danger, though keep in mind that a lot of protests pass that threshold and then ultimately go nowhere. To turn the story international, Trump specifically threatened Tehran on this. If you start shooting protesters, we will start shooting you. Well, that ship may have sailed, but the United States has done nothing, at least thus far. Nonetheless, given the recent operational success with the fracas in Caracas, some wonder if it is only a matter of time until we see a tempest in Tehran. With the plausibility and potential consequences of military action our focus for today, as a starting point, we should enjoy a bit of a geography lesson. Caracas is here, right up against the Caribbean. Venezuela's navy is a joke, so the United States could position its assets nearby and get right on top of the target without much challenge. That is how the United States has instituted an oil blockade without much effort. Washington has the resources for this. Caracas lacks the military capacity to respond. In contrast, Tehran is all the way over here, nowhere near a coastline. Sorry, Caspian Sea, I do not count you for that. And while Israel spent 12 days in June systematically destroying every anti-aircraft system that it could find, something that may prove critical later, this is still a big ask. When looking at distances this large, the only plausible option for right now is a very narrow decapitation strike. That is a task for a B-2 stealth bomber, as the United States used in the strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities about 7 months ago. Would the Trump administration be interested in such an option? Maybe, especially after arresting Maduro. International law is not much of a concern inside of the White House right now. But a big difference here is that the United States can continue exerting leverage over Maduro's successor, Delcy Rodriguez, because it would be reasonable enough to replicate the arrest. Absent that, she has no reason to cooperate. Executing a repeat strike in Iran would be significantly more difficult. Thus, the initial decapitation strike may give protesters in the country an easier path toward replacing the Ayatollah, but it would put a target on the back of the United States should the regime maintain control over the country. Washington would have a tougher time trying to deter the Ayatollah's successor without the clear ability to just kill him too. Meanwhile, we can be relatively confident that a controlled operation like what happened in Venezuela will not happen in Iran in the immediate future. It may have been easy to sleepwalk into the Venezuelan military operation for anyone not watching the news, but the United States had dumped a lot of metal into the Caribbean months ahead of time, and not for the drug interdiction operations that the media focused on. Moreover, some of those assets came from the Middle East, leaving at least a temporary deficit that the United States would need to address. You would want, at minimum, 2 carriers to handle such operations. However, about half of U.S. carriers sit at a home port or are undergoing maintenance at any given time. Add the Indo-Pacific as a critical theater, and that is how 0 aircraft carriers are currently near Iran. And just for clarity, it would need to be the United States here. Europe does not have the assets to project power like that, and you may recall from the leaked Signal chat that this was a source of frustration for Vice President J.D. Vance, as covering everything outside of Europe stretches U.S. forces thin. Speaking of which, remember when the only militarily interesting thing that the Trump administration had done was to try to bomb the Houthis into submission? Anyway, point is that we would see extensive operations against Iran coming. Moving the requisite ships to the region is something that is publicly observable, so keep an eye on that. Still, Trump continues to float some type of assistance to the protesters. Is there anything that the United States can do to help? Well, at least for the moment, there is a good argument that doing close to nothing is the correct call. The key to a successful revolution on the streets is for protesters to vastly outnumber security forces. This is a bar that is generally hard to clear, because the protesters have to coordinate a time and location. Someone who goes by themselves just gets arrested. The status quo, therefore, normally favors the government. But here and now, the genie is already out of the bottle, so to speak. The Iranian government attempted to curtail coordination by shutting off the internet to the country. As an aside, that has made it hard for me to get the stock images for this video. C'est la vie. But on top of making my life difficult, that measure may have come too late to help the government. Iranians were already all over the streets. Coordination is less important when all you have to do is step outside of your house, and you immediately find yourself in the middle of the fire. In terms of military action, there is not much that any foreign actor can do at this point to help. This is not yet like a situation in Libya circa 2011, where there was a conventional military confrontation between the government and the rebel group. The government was using air assets to bomb the rebels into oblivion, and a NATO-led coalition instituted a no-fly zone. As long as the primary vector of resistance in Iran is protests on the streets, the best you might be able to do is destroy government weapons caches to make it slightly more difficult for security forces. Or, again, if you are both lucky and adventurous, a decapitation strike. However, each of those comes with some risk of triggering a rally round the flag effect. It may not be a high chance if no one trusts the government anyway, but if things are going the way that the United States wants them to at the moment, then it does not make sense to gamble unnecessarily. Something that might be both more effective and sidestep rally around the flag concerns is a cyber attack, a covert action that the regime would not as easily be able to pin on foreign agitators. If the internet is down for protesters, disrupt the government's lines of communication as well. Or, with a certain sense of irony, you could attack Iran's ability to shut down the internet, opening the news feeds back to protesters. Alternatively, you could target banks to create greater financial instability for the government. Say, delay the next paychecks for security forces, and make them rethink their priorities. The more aggressive version of this is to park a bunch of ships nearby the Strait of Hormuz or Gulf of Oman, and start doing tanker interdictions like what is happening around Venezuela. Iran needs oil revenues to fund basically everything. An embargo there would be just as crippling as it has been to Venezuela. You would also make Beijing furious in the process, though, so good luck with handling that part of the politics. But there are more practical problems here as well. Aside from Iran having better missile systems than Venezuela, and the dangers that that would entail for the U.S. Navy, the Coast Guard only has so many ships to make the interdictions, and indications are that the United States is already stretched thin in the Caribbean. You could start having the Navy take charge of the enforcement operations, but at least thus far the United States has not done that for legal reasons, something one suspects that the Trump administration would be flexible on if the situation called for it. Then you have a weird situation where a bunch of leaders sitting in Europe are thinking to themselves, please deploy to Iran, because then you cannot deploy a flotilla to a third combat zone, say one further up north. They may not be alone either. There are reports claiming that the U.S. military views action in Greenland as illegal. Whenever Trump brings it up, they try to pivot to other places in the world. This is not what political scientists have in mind when they talk about diversionary war, but welcome to the latest twist that 2026 has brought us. Moving on, if the conflict ever does turn into a conventional battle, the Libyan experience might give interventionists a moment of pause. It is not exactly remembered fondly in the halls of Brussels, As we discussed recently, foreign-imposed regime change rarely works out well. Iran looks more like a Syrian case anyway. Syria is smaller than Libya, but Libya had less relevant territory to cover. There's a lot of desert down there. Part of the reason that the United States did not duplicate the Libyan strategy was that it was just too complicated to cover so much ground. Well, Iran is even larger in terms of relevant ground to cover, even if it is still slightly smaller than Libya. And I am not just talking about the distance to the capital here, like I was focused on a few minutes ago. This is about conducting protection operations across most of the landmass. On the flip side, Russia is too preoccupied to complicate matters in Iran, like was the case in Syria. That is what happens when you fight a war, which, as of today, has lasted as long as the Eastern Front of World War II. One last thing to point out here if the United States does intervene. We have done a feature-length treatment on this before, but the super captivating nuclear option, in the absence of an actual nuclear option, is for Iran to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. The reason that this is generally a silly strategy on the surface is that Iran needs the strait open to export its own oil, as I mentioned when we were discussing an oil embargo. But much like real nuclear weapons, if the regime thinks that it is close to done anyway, then they might not care. Desperate times call for desperate measures, even if there is no clear theory on how this would solve the problem. Just start flying Shaheds at anything that moves over there. If this is even slightly on the horizon, the United States would be tempted to deploy assets to the region to be ready to respond. But that lowers the barrier to taking more proactive measures. Thus, simultaneously, we should not be certain that the United States is about to bomb Iran because the Navy arrives. But if the Navy arrives, we might start to wonder. While we wait to see how this unfolds, you can check out that feature-length production on shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.